The prairie dusk spread itself wide and endless, the sky painted in the tired hues of burnt rose and fading gold. Dust swirled in the main street of Dry Creek, curling around boots and wagon wheels like the restless breath of old ghosts. It was in that fading hour, when shadows grew long and whispers longer, that a young woman found herself standing alone before the mercantile, a trunk at her feet, and a hollow ache swelling inside her chest. Her name was Clara May, and at 22 she had crossed half a continent on faith alone. She had stitched every dream she owned into letters sent across the miles, letters answered by a man whose promises of hearth and home had filled her with trembling hope. That man, Jedediah Croft, was now standing 3 paces away, broad-shouldered and heavy in the jaw, shaking his head as though the very sight of her offended him. His voice, low but sharp enough for every ear nearby, carved its wound without mercy. "Too slight for frontier living," he muttered, as if declaring her frailty were enough to erase her journey, enough to make her invisible. Then he turned his back, leaving her there as though she were nothing more than unwanted cargo delivered to the wrong door. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the shuffling of townsfolk pretending not to watch. But Dry Creek was a place where no secret remained unturned, and every glance carried judgment. Whispers grew in the corners, abandoned already, some said, while others hid smirks behind their hands. Clara May felt the heat rise to her face, the sting of shame sharper than the dry wind tugging at her bonnet ribbons. She did not cry. She stood as still as the post beside her, though her heart hammered like a bird desperate to escape a snare. Her fingers, pale and stiff from travel, pressed against her trunk as though it were the last anchor she could hold. She had given up everything, home, kin, even her name's safety, to chase the promise of belonging, and in a breath that promise had shattered. From across the street, another figure had been watching. Elias Boone sat astride a weary bay horse, his hat pulled low against the slanting sun. At 32, his face bore the quiet weathering of a man who had worked too many seasons alone, the kind of solitude that carved lines deeper than age. He had known rejection himself, had carried the silent ache of not being chosen, not being enough. And as he looked at the girl left standing with nothing but the town's eyes on her, he felt the stir of something he could neither name nor ignore. He dismounted without a word, his boots sounding a steady rhythm on the boards as he crossed to her side. Clara did not lift her gaze, not until she felt the weight of her trunk being lifted with ease. She looked up then, startled, into the shadow of his brim, into eyes that were neither pitying nor prying, but steady, as if seeing her without the veil of judgment. "My cabin's not far," he said simply, his voice low, worn but kind. "You can rest there." It was not a proposal, not a rescue painted in grand words, but a statement plain as the land itself. And yet, to Clara, it was a lifeline. She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and followed as he led horse and trunk alike away from the gathering stares. Behind them, gossip bloomed fresh, curling into the air like smoke. Boone's taken her in? What for? Some laughed, others clucked their tongues, but neither Elias nor Clara turned back to answer. The cabin stood at the edge of the valley, small against the horizon, built of logs darkened by seasons of wind and rain. It was the home of a man used to silence, with only the smell of wood smoke and the neat order of sparse belongings to speak of him. When Elias set her trunk by the wall and pushed the door open wider, Clara stepped into a space that felt both strange and safe, as if the world outside could not follow her there. She perched on the edge of a chair, her hands folded tight in her lap, uncertain if she had the right to breathe in this borrowed place. Elias moved with quiet assurance, setting bread and coffee on the table without flourish, as though offering a guest such things were natural. She whispered her thanks, voice fragile as cracked porcelain, but he did not press her to speak more. Instead, he busied himself with the fire, his broad frame bent to coax flame from embers until the room glowed with gentle warmth. That first night, Clara lay awake on a pallet by the hearth, staring at the low ceiling while the wind pressed against the cabin walls. Every creak of timber, every sigh of the night seemed to tell her she had not been cast away entirely. Outside, the world might label her unfit, but within those 4 walls, she was simply present, allowed to exist without scorn. It was a gift she had not expected. The days that followed settled into a rhythm both delicate and sure. Clara found herself rising early, sweeping the floor, mending torn shirts left long neglected. She fetched water with hands that ached but refused to falter, stirred beans over the fire, and patched worn blankets with quiet determination. Each small task stitched back a piece of dignity that had been torn from her in the street. Elias never asked it of her, never demanded, yet she gave freely, needing to prove her worth not to him, but to herself. He, in turn, gave her the space to breathe. He split wood until his shoulders gleamed with sweat in the sun, carried in kindling, and left extra biscuits on her side of the table without comment. He was not a man of many words, but his silence was not cold. It was a silence that steadied, that held room enough for her shame and her slow rebuilding. In town, the murmurs grew sharper. At the Mercantile, Clara felt eyes scrape against her skin, measuring her, dismissing her. "Living with Boone," they muttered. Some hinted she was a burden, others whispered worse. She kept her gaze down, hands clenched around her basket, but each word lodged deep, a stone she carried back with her. Elias walked beside her, never correcting their tongues, never confronting the gossip. His indifference was its own defiance, a shield she could stand beneath, though she often wondered if she deserved such shelter. Yet slowly, within her chest, something began to shift. Each evening spent by the fire, each moment of quiet labor shared, lit a small spark that refused to be snuffed out by judgment. She found herself humming while she mended, found herself meeting his gaze longer when he returned from the fields, found herself breathing deeper, as though the very air in that cabin was teaching her how to belong again. The memory of rejection still stung, but it no longer defined her. In its place grew the fragile awareness that perhaps she was not only salvageable, but valuable. And though neither spoke of it, a thread had been woven between them, thin, tentative, but strong enough to catch the light. By the time autumn's edge sharpened into early frost, Clara could feel the ground beneath her steadying. She was no longer the woman trembling at the mercy of another's choice. She was learning to stand, to endure, to exist in a space where kindness had given her room to grow. The world beyond their door still whispered, but inside that cabin, her worth was no longer in question. And as she set bread on the table one quiet evening, Elias glanced at her with that same steady look from the first day, neither pity nor expectation, but recognition. It was enough to tell her that the story she feared had ended in humiliation was, perhaps, only just beginning. The first frost did not arrive quietly. It swept across the prairie in a shroud of white breath, rhyming the tall grasses and glazing the cabin's roof in silver. Clara woke to find her breath clouding in the air, the fire long gone cold. Elias was already outside, his axe rising and falling with steady rhythm, each strike splitting frozen wood with a sound that echoed across the valley. She watched him from the window for a long moment, the sight both humbling and strangely steadying. Here was a man who lived not by prideful words but by the endurance of his hands. The cold days pressed them closer, not by design but by necessity. The cabin's walls seemed smaller, the fire more essential. Clara found herself sharing tasks with him in a rhythm that felt almost like a dance, passing kindling, stirring stew, mending coats while he worked leather by the fire. There was little conversation, yet each glance exchanged held a weight that lingered after words would have vanished. She began to see in him a quiet patience, a kind of loyalty that asked for nothing yet offered everything. But the town had not forgotten her humiliation. On a day when the sky threatened snow, Elias rode with Clara into Dry Creek to buy flour and salt. The Mercantile was warm and close, the air thick with gossip and coal smoke. As she moved between shelves, she heard the sharp hiss of voices not meant to be hidden. Asterisk, she's still at Boone's. Shameful. A woman ought to know her place. Asterisk, the words fell like blows, each one driving the sting of shame deeper. She stood frozen, basket clutched to her chest, until Elias appeared at her side. He did not raise his voice nor glare at them, but simply took the basket from her and walked her to the counter with the same calm assurance he gave to every small act. His silence was a shield, and she found herself breathing again, though the whispers still clawed at her ears. When they stepped out into the cold street, another voice cut sharper than the rest. Jedediah Croft stood by his wagon, his expression sour, his tone curling with disdain. "Didn't reckon you'd last, Boone," he sneered. "She ain't fit for frontier living. You'll be feeding a burden till your back breaks." The words struck Clara harder than the first rejection, for they were spoken not in dismissal but in mockery, designed to wound. She felt herself shrink, the humiliation fresh, but before the ache could swallow her, Elias stepped forward. He placed himself between her and Jedediah, his stance steady as stone. His voice, low but edged with steel, carried farther than she had ever heard it. She works harder than most men I've known. She stays. Jedediah spat in the dirt, his eyes flashing. You'll regret it. Then he turned, climbing into his wagon, the wheels crunching over frost as he left. Clara stood trembling, the sound of Elias's defense echoing louder than her own heartbeat. For the first time, she realized he had not simply offered her shelter out of pity. He had chosen her presence, defended it, declared it worthy against the very man who had cast her aside. Something inside her, fragile and long buried, stirred awake. Winter deepened with merciless grip. Snow fell thick, winds howled across the valley, and the cabin became their world entire. Supplies dwindled faster than either expected. Clara, unwilling to let fear take root, insisted on riding out with Elias to gather wood. The cold cut through her cloak, her breath burned in her chest, but she kept pace beside him. When her strength faltered, she forced her legs to move, unwilling to prove Jedediah's words true. But in the deep snow her foot slipped, and she stumbled hard. Elias was there in an instant, lifting her before she could fall further, wrapping his heavy coat around her shivering frame. His arms, strong and steady, shielded her against the wind as he guided her back to the cabin. Inside, firelight flickered against the logs as he worked quickly, rubbing warmth into her frozen hands, his touch careful, reverent. She tried to pull away, ashamed of her weakness, but his grip held, not tight, not demanding, only steady. "Don't," he said softly. "You've nothing to prove." The words pierced her deeper than the cold. She turned her face from him, ashamed of the tears that came, but he caught them anyway, his thumb brushing them away with unexpected tenderness. That night, as snow piled against the door, she found herself speaking the truth she had kept caged since the day of her rejection. Her voice trembled, but she did not stop. "I came here thinking someone wanted me. And when he turned away, I thought maybe it was me that wasn't worth wanting. I've been afraid every day that I'm only a burden to you too." The silence that followed felt endless. Elias sat across from her, firelight carving lines across his face, his eyes fixed steady on hers. Then he reached for the shirt she had mended for him, holding it over his heart. "You've mended more than cloth here," he said. His voice was rough, almost breaking, but there was no hesitation in it. He did not declare love with grand words, but with the weight of truth carried in his tone. Clara felt the ache inside her shift. It was not sudden, not a flood of passion, but a steady bloom, like the thaw beneath snow. She looked at him and saw not the man who had lifted her trunk from the street, but the man who had chosen her again and again in small, silent ways. The man who defended her when she could not defend herself, who gave her space when she could barely breathe, who offered loyalty without asking anything in return. The snow gave way to spring at last. Buds appeared on branches, rivers swelled with meltwater, and the prairie began to breathe again. With the change of season came a change in Clara herself. She no longer walked a step behind in town but beside Elias, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. The whispers had not ceased, but they no longer pierced her as they once did. She had found in herself something stronger than shame, dignity born of endurance, of small acts that had become the fabric of her worth. One morning, as the sun rose across the valley, she stood at the cabin door, the scent of coffee drifting behind her. Elias joined her, his hand brushing hers as naturally as the dawn itself. They said nothing for a long time, watching light spill across the land. Words were not needed. The silence between them was no longer emptiness but belonging. The cabin that had once been only a refuge now felt alive, filled not with the echo of loneliness but with the steady pulse of home. Clara realized that love had not come to her as she once dreamed it might, in declarations, in sweeping gestures, but in quiet presence, in hands that steadied, in eyes that saw her without judgment. It had come in kindness, repeated until it was stronger than shame. And as she stood with Elias, watching the world stretch wide before them, she felt certain of one truth: she had not been abandoned after all. She had been found.